287 days. That is how long a man named Harry stayed consistent before he almost convinced himself that compounding was a joke. Not because he had done anything especially foolish, not because he had gambled, not because he had picked some ridiculous stock and watched it collapse. He was doing what every respectable financial video article and book had told him to do. He was investing steadily. He was buying broad exposure. He was staying in the game. And after 287 days, the number on the screen still looked so unimpressive that he felt almost insulted by his own discipline. That is where the real story begins. Because the first stage of compounding does not feel like growth. It feels like disbelief. I want you to understand that sentence deeply, not just as a clever line, as an operating truth. Most people do not fail at compounding because compounding is weak. They fail because the early experience of compounding is emotionally unconvincing. That is the trap. Human beings want effort to produce visible reward on a schedule that flatters the effort. Go to work, get paid, lift the weight, feel stronger, practice the skill. Notice improvement. The brain likes straight lines between cause and reward. Compounding refuses to behave that way. Compounding is patient in a way most people are not. It gives you very little emotional encouragement early and then much later begins acting as if it had been doing more all along than you were wise enough to notice. That is why people quit. Not because the mathematics were failing, because the scoreboard was telling the story in the wrong language. Harry was not a financier, not some 26-year-old with 2 monitors, a blue light on his face, and the vocabulary of a man who thinks risk is a personality trait. He was a hotel front desk agent, rotating shifts, tired feet, customer smiles, late nights, early mornings. The kind of job where you can work hard all week and still have the unpleasant sensation that the money leaves faster than it arrives. He took home $3,379 a month. He split a cramped 2-bedroom place with a roommate. He drank too much vending machine coffee because the shifts were strange and the sleep was worse. He kept telling himself he would get serious about investing when life finally settled down. If that sounds familiar to you, good, it is supposed to. Harry is not unusual. He is ordinary in exactly the way that matters. Different job, same pressure, different city, same arithmetic, different face, same private fear that maybe he is already behind and the only people getting ahead are people with bigger incomes, fewer obligations, or much better timing. He tried the usual motivation tricks. He watched the success clips. He downloaded the investing apps. He stared at long-term charts until they looked like promises instead of pictures. He told himself this month would be the month he stayed disciplined without fail. Then the market dipped. His account moved down and the little voice appeared. What is the point? Why am I doing this? That voice is older than the stock market. It visits almost everyone. It does not come because you are lazy. It comes because the human brain hates delayed proof. That is the uncomfortable truth. The early years of investing usually do not fail because the investor lacks information. They fail because the investor misreads the experience. He mistakes the quiet stage for a broken stage. He thinks the fact that it feels slow means it is not working. In reality, the slow feeling is part of the design. Once you understand that, the whole project changes. I have spent my life around capital, and one of the great misunderstandings ordinary people have about compounding is that they think compounding begins when the account gets larger. Number compounding begins with repetition. What gets larger later is not the start of compounding. It is the visible proof that the earlier repetition mattered. The first stage is not spectacle, it is construction. This is why I like the central mental model in the source material you gave me. It calls it the 8-4-3 rule and treats it not as magic, not as a guarantee, and not as a timing trick, but as a patience model for how compounding tends to feel across time. That is a sensible instinct. Contentra Frenzoe cite one fe inde fe one fe I would put it this way. Compounding tends to feel like 3 different lives. In the first life, you do almost all the work. In the second life, your money begins helping enough that the partnership finally feels visible. In the third life, the money starts working hard enough that you almost cannot believe how unimpressive the early years once seemed. The arithmetic is continuous, the emotional experience is not. That is why people get lost. Harry did not need another spreadsheet. He did not need another video telling him to stay motivated. He needed a way to remain faithful long enough that the machine he was building could become visible to him. That is a very different problem. Most people try to solve that problem with intensity. I prefer systems. Intensity is weather. Systems are infrastructure. A man who depends on feeling inspired every payday is going to have very spotty investing results, because paydays arrive in the same life where arguments, fatigue, car repairs, low moods, boredom, envy, and distraction also arrive. A better design is to tie the habit to something that already happens regardless of mood. This is why Harry came up with what he called the key card rule. Every time he clocked out of the hotel, he held the room, accessed key card in his hand for 10 seconds, and asked one question: did I buy my future today? That was the whole question. No budgeting ceremony, no guilt recital, no dramatic promise, just a question tied to a physical trigger in the same moment every day. If the answer was yes, he went home. If the answer was no, he did not spiral. He did not call himself weak. He did not decide the month was ruined. He took one small action. Sometimes he walked to the lobby ATM and withdrew a single crisp bill, not to spend but to make the missed action feel tangible. Then he opened his brokerage app and bought a little more of his index fund, sometimes $37, sometimes $51, sometimes $29. Not enough to impress anyone, exactly enough to keep the structure alive. This is another thing people misunderstand. The size of the early contribution matters less than the continuity of the identity. A person who buys small but often is building a self. A person who waits to buy large when things are better is often building delay disguised as responsibility. I have always admired repeatable action more than dramatic intention. Dramatic intention makes people feel noble and changes little. Repeatable action makes people feel ordinary and changes everything. Now, before we go further, let us deal with what Harry was actually buying. This sounds simple. It is not. A lot of people think they understand index funds, when what they really understand is that someone online told them index funds are safe. I dislike secondhand certainty. An index fund is not some magical object. It is a basket. You are not buying one stock. You are buying a slice of many businesses at once. Think of it less like choosing one song and more like owning the whole playlist. You do not need to predict which one track will become the anthem of the decade. You need exposure to the productive orchestra. That matters for two reasons. First, it reduces the harm from being wrong about any single company. Second, it lets you participate in the long-run growth of the business system itself without turning your life into an endless audition for stock-picking genius. That is why I have so often recommended broad, low-cost index funds for ordinary people. They turn the problem from prediction into participation. I do not need the average family to outsmart Wall Street. I need them to own something productive and stay in long enough for the ownership to matter. That is already hard enough. The source text uses a fine metaphor here too. It says the market is like the ocean, chaotic up close and calmer when you zoom out. That is right, contentra francoea site, tufe inde, tufe daily market movement is noisy because millions of people, institutions, fears, hopes, businesses, and headlines are colliding at once. The longer your horizon, the more that noise starts looking like weather over a much larger body of water. This is why I always say that the early period feels misleading. A person contributes $237 a month or $190 or $412, and after a year the account still does not look like freedom. He thinks something is wrong. Nothing is wrong. He is simply still in the stage where contributions are doing all the visible labor. That is not a sign of failure. That is the design. The first 8 years, give or take, are not supposed to impress you. They're supposed to build the engine. That is the part of the 843 rule I would want people never to forget. The first 8 are for becoming unbreakable, not glamorous. Not thrilling, unbreakable, and that word matters because most investing failure is not mathematical failure. It is behavioral fracture. The person sells because the market fell. The person stops contributing because life got expensive. The person cashes out because The accounts still look too small to justify continuing. The person mistakes boredom for evidence that the system is wrong. That is what must be prevented first. Returns come later, staying power comes first. Harry began at zero. He committed to an average of $237 a month, not because that number was magical, because it fit his life tightly enough to be difficult and loosely enough to be repeatable. That is another important point. Your investing system should not be built at a level so heroic that one bad month destroys the streak. The streak matters more than the heroic month. A lot of people think discipline means choosing the biggest number that sounds noble. That is not discipline. That is vanity with a calculator. Discipline means choosing an amount you can protect. By the end of his first year, Harry had put in roughly $2,844. It did not feel life-changing by the end of year 3. It still did not look impressive in the dramatic way the internet tells people money should look. That is exactly the trap, because after 3 years, a human mind begins making a very dangerous argument. If 3 years did not change my life, why would 15? That argument ruins people. Not because it is emotional, because it is badly timed. The whole point of compounding is that the earlier years are the least persuasive and the most important. They are least persuasive because the account still lacks mass. They are most important because they determine whether you remain present for the later stage when mass changes the feel of the whole machine. People quit in year 3, 5, 6, or 7 not because compounding failed them, but because they abandoned the bridge before reaching the other side. That is why Harry built penalties around quitting, not huge penalties, behavioral ones. If he ever sold out during a panic, he owed his roommate $43 in cash immediately. That sounds childish. Good. Many effective systems sound childish. People keep trying to solve emotional problems with sophisticated language. Sometimes a small physical consequence works far better. Do I want to pay $43 to be emotional today? Number 5. Then I stay put. This is what adults should understand about investing psychology. A tiny friction added to a bad behavior can save you from a huge mistake. A tiny ritual added to a good behavior can sustain you through long dry periods. No philosopher is needed, no motivational anthem is needed, just enough mechanism that your worst impulses stop being costless. Harry also changed the scoreboard. This is one of the wisest moves in the source material. He stopped tracking dollars and started tracking shares. Content reference OA site 3, Fay Index Fay 3 Fay that is brilliant for a beginner. Dollars are emotional. They rise, fall, and appear to tell a story about whether you are winning today. Shares are quieter. Shares answer a different question. How much ownership have I accumulated? When the market falls, a person watching only dollars feels poorer. A person watching shares understands something else is happening too. The same contribution is now buying more ownership. That is not the whole story. Of course, a terrible business can keep falling, and more shares will not rescue you. But with a broad productive index, the mental shift is enormously valuable. It turns declines from personal insults into chances to stack more of the playlist. Harry wrote the share count on an index card and taped it inside his closet door. One number updated every week. No percentages, no forecasts, no emotional interpretation. Just the count that changed the narrative. Because during the first stage of compounding, progress is best measured by accumulation, not by apparent riches. This is one reason I have always thought the average person needs a simpler money dashboard than he imagines. Too much detail invites too much feeling, and too much feeling usually leads to too much bad action. Now, because life is real, not theoretical, the true test of a system is what happens when trouble comes. Trouble came for Harry in the form it comes for millions of people. His car needed repairs. Not a charming little oil change and a shrug, a real bill, $979. He stared at the checking account, felt that familiar tightening in the chest, and saw the oldest temptation in middle-class life. Sell the investments, pause the plan. Handle the present problem first and tell yourself you will restart later. This is how the slide begins, not with a grand collapse, with a completely understandable interruption. I do not judge people harshly for feeling that temptation. I judge the structure if it was built so thin that every ordinary problem becomes a referendum on the future. Harry did something important instead. He picked up extra shifts for 2 weeks and paid the repair without selling. That one decision probably mattered more than any clever stock movie could have made that year. Why? Because it taught him who he was becoming. He was not building an account. He was building a person who did not cash out future ownership to solve every present inconvenience. That identity is worth a great deal. People think wealth begins when the numbers get large. Wealth often begins when identity changes, when a person stops saying, "I hope I become disciplined someday," and starts proving in small moments that he already behaves like an owner. That is a much deeper shift. The source text quotes James Clear's idea that you do not rise to your goals, you fall to your systems. I have no objection to that sentence. It is true. Content reference OA site, 4FA index, FA 4FA. Most people treat goals like little emotional speeches. They give themselves in January and break by March. Systems are different. Systems survive boredom, and boredom is the real gatekeeper here. People fear bear markets, crashes, recessions, and inflation. Those things matter. But for the average investor, boredom may be even more dangerous because it arrives quietly and asks a poisonous question. Is this really worth it? The first 8 years are where that question must be defeated, not with hype, with structure. Now let us talk about the middle stage. Years 9 through 12, roughly speaking. This is where people begin confusing the machine with their own genius. I do not like that confusion. It has ruined many investors. The person survives the slow stage, sees the account finally begin to move in bigger chunks, and decides he must now be naturally gifted. He simply stayed around long enough for the engine to begin assisting. That is different. When Harry crossed that threshold, the experience changed. Not because the market changed its laws, because the balance had enough mass that returns began to matter alongside contributions. In the first stage, your money is mostly a passenger you keep feeding. In the second stage, it becomes a visible coworker. That is the point where a good month in the market can add more than an entire week's contribution. This is psychologically thrilling and strategically dangerous. Thrilling because the engine finally feels real. Dangerous because this is when people get cocky, they think they found the code, they believe they are good at investing. Very often what happened is simply this. They did not quit. That is already rare enough. Harry did the right thing. He stayed boring. He kept buying the playlist. He kept using the key card rule. He kept updating the share count. He kept treating declines like sales rather than personal insults. The middle stage rewards steadiness precisely because it is the stage where many people begin damaging themselves with self-congratulation. The account rises enough that they become tempted to trade more, guess more, rotate more, chase more, or take some profits, simply because the machine finally feels alive. I have always disliked that urge. An engine is not improved by being taken apart every weekend. Now let us speak about the final 3 years in the 8-4-3 framing. Not because the math is exact in some mystical way, not because every portfolio will obey a cartoon schedule, because the experience changes again. There comes a point when the returns begin behaving like a second contributor with real weight. This is the phase everyone wants and very few reach, not because it is reserved for the rich, because so many people exit during the long, unimpressive construction period. If you push a car, the first inches are frustrating. Same force, minimal drama, then momentum helps. Then the thing that resisted starts rolling. That does not mean the car became magical. It means the same effort is now working through a different physical condition. Compounding is similar. There comes a stage where the earlier money has sat long enough that it begins producing gains large enough to feel almost like a third party joined the arrangement. That is what people call money working for you. But even that phrase can be misunderstood. The money did not suddenly wake up and become noble. It had been working the whole time. You simply could not feel it clearly, because the account lacked enough accumulated weight. This is why I want ordinary people to stop demanding entertainment from compounding. It is not there to entertain you. It is there to transform repeated small acts into eventual disproportionate results. The transformation is delayed. That is the design, not a flaw. The flaw is demanding visible excitement from a process whose best work happens quietly for a long time. Now let me move from Harry back to you, because stories are useful only if they return you to your own life with greater clarity. What should an ordinary person do with this? First, stop asking compounding to feel exciting in the beginning. The first years are for engine building. If you understand that, you stop misreading slowness as failure. Second, choose something simple enough that you can actually hold. A broad, low-cost index fund remains the classic answer, because it reduces the need for prediction and keeps you owning the productive machine rather than your private guesses. Third, build a trigger that is stronger than mood. Payday can work, but payday alone often turns investing into a monthly debate. Use a cue that already exists in your life. Leaving work, brushing your teeth, parking the car, lunch break, something repeatable. The brain respects repeated context more than noble speeches. Fourth, measure what matters early. In the beginning, the victory is often not a beautiful account balance. It is the share count, the accumulated ownership, the streak itself. If you keep staring only at dollars, you will keep inviting emotion to dominate the interpretation. Fifth, build a small penalty for panic and a small reward for staying the course. Human beings are not above childish mechanisms. We are often saved by them. Sixth, never let ordinary setbacks become an excuse to permanently raid the engine. Sometimes life truly requires it. I am not making a religion out of never touching money, but I want the default to be adaptation, not liquidation. That is why the emergency fund matters. That is why margin matters. That is why cheap housing, sensible transportation, and not bloating the fixed life matter. The strongest investing plan in the world cannot survive a life structure that keeps forcing it to bleed out every 6 months. This is another reason I think people underestimate how connected all financial behavior really is. Compounding is not only a market question, it is a lifestyle question. The person with too much rent, too much car, too many recurring obligations, and no cash reserve will keep being forced into bad choices at exactly the moments when staying invested matters most. The person with margin has the privilege of patience. That is one of the highest return privileges in finance. Now, I want to say something about the word slow. People use that word carelessly. They say compounding is slow, as if slow automatically means inefficient. A seed in the ground is slow too. The first time you walk past it, you see dirt. The second time, still dirt. The 10th time, perhaps a tiny sign that something underneath has not been idle. Compounding is like that. The ground looks unconvincing before the structure breaks the surface. The untrained eye sees nothing. The patient eye understands that nothing visible does not mean nothing is happening. That is why I refuse to call the early stage a waste. It is the stage that decides the rest. A person who survives the invisible stage has done the hardest psychological work in the whole process. Once the machine starts helping, the path becomes easier emotionally, even if life itself remains hard. That is why quitting in year 6 or year 7 is so tragic. The person walks away not from a broken system, but from the threshold where the relationship between his effort and the visible results is finally about to change. The source text says quitting is fast and compounding only appears slow. I like that line because it captures the asymmetry. Contentor frenso side. 5 fe inde fe 5 fe compounding. Asks for time and gives back force later. Quitting gives immediate emotional relief and quietly steals force from the future. Fast and expensive, slow and powerful, that is the true contrast. I have seen the same principle all across business. A retailer opens one good location, then a second, then a third. At first, the economics look underwhelming because fixed costs dominate and scale has not yet helped enough. Later, the network begins working. The early struggle was not failure. It was precondition. An insurer writes sensible policies for years and accumulates float. At first, it looks ordinary. Later, the capital base becomes a quiet advantage. So strong outsiders forget how long it took to build. Again, not sudden magic, deferred visibility. A family pays down toxic debt, builds reserves, and starts small automatic investments. For years, nothing looks dramatic. Then one day the portfolio is large enough that a good year in the market adds more than the family once saved in 2 or 3 years of discipline. People call this luck. It is not luck. It is delayed recognition. That is what I want ordinary people to understand. The market does not usually reward you at the speed your emotions prefer. It rewards you at the speed compounding prefers. Those are different clocks. You can either adapt to the correct clock or keep accusing reality of being unfair. Reality will not change. So what would I tell a tired person tonight? Someone with a real job, a real family, real bills, and that familiar thought that perhaps this whole investing exercise is too small to matter. I would tell him this: your first task is not to get rich. Your first task is to become unbreakable. Build the streak, build the identity, build the reserve, build the habit of buying productive ownership even when the amounts look small and the account still looks unimpressive. Treat the first 8 years as engine construction. Refuse to ask the machine for excitement while it is still learning how to carry weight. Track what you own, not only what it is worth today. Make quitting expensive, make consistency automatic, and when the market falls, do not ask why this is happening to you. Ask whether the businesses inside the basket are still there, still productive, still part of the larger machine of human effort and profit. If the answer is yes, then lower prices are not a moral judgment. They are simply a rough period in the same ocean. I also want him to know that feeling discouraged in the early years does not mean he is unsuited for investing. It means he is human. That feeling is common because the design of compounding delays emotional reward. The important thing is not never feeling discouraged. It is refusing to let discouragement become policy. That is a much better standard. People set impossible emotional standards for themselves and then behave as if ordinary doubt disqualifies them. Number ordinary doubt is part of the terrain. The winners are not those who never doubt. They are those who built structures that do not give doubt final authority. That is what Harry did with the key card. That is what any sensible person can do with his own version of the rule. He attached the future to a repeatable moment in the present. That is powerful. The future is often too abstract to fight for directly. A trigger in the hand is concrete. I have always liked concrete things. A man can say, I want financial freedom for 10 years and accomplish little. The same man can tie one small action to one unavoidable daily trigger and quietly transform his whole life. That is not glamorous enough for the self-help industry. It is real enough for me. So yes, compounding feels slow until it does not. Yes, the early stage is boring. That is why so few reach the stage where it becomes astonishing. Yes, the account can look unimpressive for years. That says more about your expectations than about the machine. And yes, you may sometimes feel foolish buying $37 or $51 or whatever small amount your life can honestly protect. Ignore that feeling. The amount is not embarrassing. Embarrassment is waiting for some future version of yourself to be more disciplined than the present version. The present version must do the work. The future version will collect the consequences. That is how all worthwhile systems work. You do not need a perfect start. You need a protected pattern. You do not need a giant contribution. You need a contribution that survives the ordinary chaos of life. You do not need to feel rich in year 2. You need to remain in the game long enough that your money begins doing the heavy lifting later. That is the handoff. That is the whole dream. And if you can keep your hands off the engine long enough, one day you will look at the account and feel something very different from the insult Harry felt after his first 287 days. You will feel weight, real weight. Enough weight that the process no longer looks like pouring water into sand. It looks like momentum. At that point, people around you may begin saying you got disciplined. Number, you got patient. And patience, when coupled with structure, becomes one of the highest return assets available to an ordinary person. I have seen that enough times to trust it completely. That is why I do not laugh at small beginnings. I respect them because almost every great pile of capital first existed in a stage where outsiders would have dismissed it as too slow to matter. The outsider was wrong. The machine was simply still being built. That is all build it anyway.